Every time I stand in a library like this one, surrounded by shelves of stories and the quiet hum of imagination, I feel like I've come full circle. Because libraries are where most of us first learn that stories are magic, that words can open doors, heal hearts, and make the world feel a little less lonely.
Good evening, everybody. So it is a pleasure to be here in the meeting room at the Norwell Public Library with you today. I'm honored to introduce someone very special to me and the world of storytelling, Kendra Vaughan, an author who writes magical, mystical, meaningful fiction. Her debut novel, The Plymbury Witch, takes readers on a journey to a small coastal town in Massachusetts where the ordinary and the extraordinary blend seamlessly. Her stories are heartfelt and filled with wisdom and a touch of magic. She has a gift of bringing life's challenges to the page with an air of lightheartedness and whimsy, which makes for a fun, uplifting read. But Kendra isn't just a writer. She has a deep passion for storytelling, finding meaning in everyday moments and weaving together reality and magic in ways that make us reflect on our lives. Her inspiration comes from the world around her, especially nature, family, and the challenges we all identify with. Today, she's here to share the inspiration behind The Plymbury Witch, and I'd like to take a minute to read the back of the book. Nestled along the coast of Massachusetts sits the quaint town of Plymbury, steeped in history, tradition, and an undercurrent of magic. Ravenna Green is the latest to inherit the mystical sea glass apothecary in this town, where stars turned to glass and fell into the ocean. Local legend whispers that after centuries of tumbling, they'd be used to grant wishes by a witch with one green and one brown eye. But when Pastor Chase Wilkinson arrives, he incites prejudice among the townspeople and a devastating fire that consumes the apothecary. With an unusable shop needing repair and multiple rejections after inquiring about a temporary space to sell her magical creations, Ravenna accepts a room in Chase's church, but with one caveat: no magic. Now, caught between two worlds, Ravenna must navigate loyalty to her lineage and a growing attraction to Chase. On one side, her heritage calls to her, a lineage of witches whose influence weaves into the very fabric of Plymbury. On the other side, the ordinary life she craves, far from the weight of her family's magical legacy and the prejudice of the conservative Christian community. Soon, Ravenna will be faced with a heart-wrenching choice: love or magic. So at the end of her speech, we're going to have some time you can have time to ask her questions that you have about her and the magical work that she's created. And then, after that, there'll be signed copies of The Plymbury Witch will be available for purchase so you can enjoy this enchanting tale. So please join me in welcoming my wife, Kendra Vaughan.
And I wanted to start by saying thank you so much for being here tonight. It means the world to me to be standing here, not just as an author, but as someone who has lived, loved, and learned in places just like this beautiful building of books in this corner of Massachusetts. And I'd like to thank Zoe Rath and the Norwell Public Library for inviting me to join you tonight as part of the Booktober Library Crawl. Libraries have always been more than just a building full of books, though. It's a place where curiosity lives and stories find their people. So tonight I'd like to spend our time sharing with you the story behind my novel, The Plymbury Witch. And although the novel is fiction, its roots run deep in the real life I lived right here on the southeastern coast of Massachusetts. It started in Duxbury, the town I call home for more than 20 years. My husband Tim grew up there, and it's where we raised our beautiful children, Alec and Alana. I remember when Tim first took me to Duxbury. He took me around town and to meet his parents, which, believe it or not, was over 30 years ago. We walked through the quaint center of town and then crossed the bridge toward the beach. And I remember thinking, wow, this town's heartbeat makes you feel like you're on permanent vacation. And over time, I learned something else about Duxbury. Beneath the picture-perfect charm, there's a depth, a quiet enchantment that hums in the background. You can feel it when you walk across the bridge at low tide, and when you stand on the beach and the fog rolls in. It's as if the town remembers things that the rest of the world forgets. And that feeling, that invisible heartbeat, is the same energy that became Plymbury, the fictional seaside town in my novel. I like to think Plymbury carries all the wonder of Duxbury, with just a little extra magic stirred in. For those who don't know me, my background actually started in hospitality, not fiction. I earned my Bachelor of Science in Hospitality Management from Johnson & Wales University, and for many years I managed hotels and restaurants. So hospitality is an interesting industry, and a wonderful one at the same time. It teaches you patience, leadership, and how to smile no matter what chaos is hiding behind the scenes. And trust me, there's a lot of chaos. If nothing else, those years prepared me for anything life could throw my way. But the truth is, I've always been a storyteller at heart, and I've always dreamed of being a novelist. I practice a lot by telling stories around the dining room table, complete with hand gestures and exaggerations to make them sound exciting. But in reality, I've always been fascinated by how people find meaning, how they heal, forgive, and rediscover themselves after life breaks them open a little bit. And that fascination eventually led me down some unexpected paths, including writing, creating communities, and studying human nature in all of its forms. And yet, if I trace the line all the way back, it really started when I was a kid. I grew up in Canton, Massachusetts, not too far from here, a close-knit town where everyone knew your name and your business. And from a young age, I noticed things, how people talked about those who were different, how curiosity could quickly turn into misunderstanding, how often fear wore the disguise of certainty. It wasn't always easy to be the one who didn't fit in neatly into the mold. But my parents taught me something that I carry with me to this day. They said, when people don't understand you, don't shrink, shine brighter. And I think that's what ultimately shaped everything I've done since, whether it was managing people, building communities, or writing stories. Because if there's one truth that's woven in through my entire life, it's that compassion is a quiet kind of magic. It changes everything it touches. When you grow up seeing how fragile kindness can be, how easily misunderstanding can turn to distance, you start to look for ways to bridge that gap. And for me, that became a calling. A lifelong search for connection between people, between beliefs, and eventually between fiction and reality. And that's where our story really begins tonight, with a woman who wanted to understand the world, followed the threads of compassion and curiosity wherever they led, and eventually found herself creating a town called Plymbury, where the lines between the ordinary and the magical blur, and transformation begins with a single act of understanding. So after college, I did what any practical 20-something does. I got a job and I paid my bills. And honestly, I loved it. Hospitality, like I said, is a wonderful industry because it's all about noticing people, what they need, what comforts them, and what makes them feel welcome. I didn't realize it at the time, but that instinct to see people, to read their energy, to meet them where they are, would become the thread that connected everything else I've ever done in my life. But when my children were small, I began to feel a tug, that inner whisper we all get when life asks us to evolve. I loved my career, but I wanted something that was more profound, something that spoke more deeply to the heart. So I followed the pull. I began gathering with people who, like me, saw the world through a magical lens. People who believed that energy connects us all, that intention shapes reality, and that the natural world is filled with quiet wisdom if you just stop long enough to listen. We were a community of seekers and believers, artists and healers, magical people who wanted a safe space to celebrate the seasons, to honor nature, and explore spirituality in a way that was rooted in compassion rather than fear. Those gatherings, small at first and then growing way bigger than we expected, became something truly special. And what I realized was that leading a community like that is really just another form of storytelling. You're listening, you're reflecting, you're helping people see the meaning in their own chapters of their lives. Those years taught me something important, that people aren't as different from one another as they'd like you to believe they are. When you take away the labels, the titles, the boundaries, you find some longings underneath it all. The desire to love and be loved, to belong, to know that our lives matter. And that truth, that thread of shared humanity, is what I carried forward when it was time to turn the page to a new chapter of my own life. I wanted to take everything I had learned, the compassion, the courage, the belief that transformation is possible, and pour it into story. Knowing I'd had this desire since I was a child, and certainly from the day he'd met me, my champion, that's what I call my husband, my champion, came to me one day and said that kids are done with college and starting to live their dreams. I think it's your turn. So with hesitation, fear, and much coaxing, I applied to the MFA in Creative Writing program at Southern New Hampshire University. I honestly don't know what I was thinking. I had to write a short story to accompany my application, and I'd never written a fiction story in my life, okay, outside of third grade. And I had a fast deadline if I wanted to make the upcoming semester start. So I bought a book on how to write a short story, really write one, with a clear protagonist, antagonist, and a real story structure. I had no idea what I was doing. I literally read that book as I was writing the short story and sent it off feeling so incredibly insecure. But by some stroke of luck, I was accepted. Admittedly, I'd written professionally before, so maybe they knew something about my prior experience writing nonfiction and editing for Simon & Schuster during my ministry that I didn't know. But very quickly, I learned the truth I somehow already knew deep inside. Writing fiction is way harder than it looks. Fiction asks you to let go of control. It's about explaining it's not about explaining what you know. It's about discovering what you feel. It's about listening to characters instead of directing them. So about halfway through my MFA program, I hit a wall. I remember sitting on a Zoom call with my professor, practically in tears, saying, I seriously have no clue what I'm doing. I've written half my book and I still don't know what I'm doing. And he said, Kendra, none of us know what we're doing. All that matters is that you look like a genius in the end. So that single sentence changed everything for me. It gave me permission to stop trying to be perfect and start trusting the process, to write with curiosity, not certainty. And somewhere in that writing journey, something clicked. All those years of listening, leading, healing, and helping people see their own light was all training for this. Because writing fiction, especially magical realism, which is the genre I write, is another way of doing the same work, helping people see the magic that already lives inside of them. Through my MFA program, yes, I learned craft elements, don't worry, I learned craft elements, I learned character arcs, I learned story structure, I learned it all. But more importantly, I learned to trust the mystery of it all, to let the story lead, to believe that sometimes the best writing, like the best living, happens when you surrender to the unknown. And that's when everything began to shift, because out of all those lessons, hospitality, healing, compassion, curiosity, a town began to take shape. A fictional place inspired by the coastline I love, filled with ordinary people touched by quiet, transformative magic. By the time I began writing The Plymbury Witch, my thesis novel, by the way, I was living in Plymouth. It was there that the name of my fictional town, Plymbury, was born. If you didn't already guess, it's a blend of Plymouth and Duxbury, the two seaside communities that have shaped my heart. Plymbury became the space between memory and imagination, a town that holds all the beauty, struggle, and quiet magic I've witnessed along the Massachusetts coast. And it was during that time that a question came to me that I couldn't stop thinking about. What would happen if a witch fell in love with a Christian minister in a town like this? That one question became the spark that lit the entire novel. I was fascinated by what could happen if two people from very different worlds worlds that might not even speak the same language of belief, could somehow find love and understanding. How do they navigate their differences? How do they face change through a lifetime of thinking only one way? How do they face the community around them? And what if their connection, instead of dividing them, became something healing? That idea, a witch and a minister, wasn't about religion or doctrine. It was about humanity, about the courage to see a person's truth and still choose compassion. And maybe that's why I'm drawn to magical realism, because it gives us a way to explore what lies beneath the surface of ordinary life. It allows us to take the unseen, our beliefs, our grief, our faith in something bigger than ourselves, and make it visible. Magical realism isn't about escaping reality like fantasy does. It's about illuminating it. The magic doesn't take us out of our world. It helps us see it more clearly. In the Plymbury Witch, the magic is quiet. It hums beneath the dialogue and the tides. That's what I find so beautiful about this kind of storytelling. It allows ordinary life and wonder to coexist. The magic doesn't announce itself. It's simply there, waiting to be seen. When I was creating Plymbury, I wanted it to feel like a real place, one that readers could walk through and smell the ocean air, feel the salt on their skin. But I also wanted it to feel a little enchanted, the way places sometimes do when your heart is open. Because I've always believed that magic isn't something separate from life. It's woven into it. It's the way we forgive, the way we love, and the way we begin again. So yes, I did set out to write a story about a witch, a modern-day witch, not the green-faced witch with warts that you see in Hollywood, whose intentions are evil, but instead a real witch with thoughts, feelings, fears, and hopes, just like everyone else. I hoped modern-day witches would be seen for who they truly are, heard, and perhaps understood. But really, I wrote a story about what it means to be human, to stand at the crossroads of love and fear, of judgment and grace, and choose to build a bridge between them. So when people ask me what the Plymbury Witch is really about, I usually smile, because the truth is it's not just one thing. It's about love, forgiveness, self-acceptance, courage, but mostly it's about transformation. The kind that doesn't happen overnight or with the wave of a wand, but the kind that begins in the quiet moments when life asks you to see yourself differently. I think transformation is the truest form of magic there is. It doesn't sparkle or announce itself. It's gentle. It's human. It happens when you decide to stop being who the world told you to be and start becoming who you already are. That's the kind of magic I write about, not the kind that defies reality, but the kind that reveals it. Because magic to me is just another word for possibility. It happens when love outlasts logic, when hope returns after loss, when you find beauty in the same places that you once held pain. And it's worth mentioning that while the Plymbury Witch touches on some deep themes like prejudice, fear, misunderstanding, and the ways we sometimes judge what we don't understand, it does not dwell there. The story offers those truths gently through human experience, and then invites the reader to decide how deeply they want to explore them. And that's the beauty of story. It meets the reader exactly where they are. Some will read it as a tale of love and second chances. Others will see it as a reflection on compassion and forgiveness, and still others will just simply enjoy it as a cozy, magical read by the sea, which is exactly what it is, a beach read, a book club read. There's laughter in it, and humor too. The kind that lives in the small absurdities of life, in the quirks of people, in those perfectly human moments when we try so hard to be composed, but our hearts have other plans. I think humor and heart belong together. They help us breathe between truths. They remind us that healing doesn't have to be solemn. Sometimes it's just funny. I love magical realism because it gives me permission to write about both, the light and the dark, the heartbreak and the humor, side by side. Because that's how life really feels, doesn't it? So no matter how a reader approaches the Plymbury Witch, my hope is that they'll find something that resonates with them. Maybe they'll see a reflection of their own journey, or maybe they'll simply fall in love with the town and the people who live there. Either way, the story belongs to them once they close the cover, to interpret, to revisit, or to simply enjoy. Because that's what stories do. They meet us in our own lives, holding up a mirror to remind us who we are, and perhaps showing us who we're still becoming. And to me, that's where the true magic lives, in the connection between the writer, the words, and the reader who carries them home. And that's how I know the spell worked. Every time I stand in a library like this one, surrounded by shelves of stories and the quiet hum of imagination, I feel like I've come full circle. Because libraries are where most of us first learn that stories are magic, that words can open doors, heal hearts, and make the world feel a little less lonely. When I think back to that girl from Canton who was always asking questions and feeling a bit out of place, I realize she's still with me. She's the one who learned that difference doesn't have to divide us. She's the one who believed in kindness even when it wasn't easy. And she's the one who never stopped looking for meaning, for that quiet kind of magic that lives in everyday life, that lives on the shelves of these walls. It's funny because if you told me years ago that I'd go from managing hotels to leading a community of magical people to writing a novel about a witch in a seaside town, I would have laughed and said, yeah, right, maybe in another lifetime. But isn't that the beauty of transformation? You don't always see it coming. And then one day you wake up and realize that every version of yourself has been preparing you for this. I think that's true for all of us. Every challenge, every change, every unexpected detour, it all becomes part of who we're meant to be. And when we look back, the moments that once felt like breaking points often turn out to be turning points. That's what the Plymbury Witch taught me, and what I hope it gently reminds readers of too, that growth doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. I think stories are one of the few places where people from completely different lives can meet and truly understand one another. We don't have to argue, we just have to listen. And that to me is a kind of spiritual connection. It's empathy made visible. Plymbury reminds us that even when the world is full of uncertainty, love and compassion still have power to heal. And sometimes believing in magic isn't about escaping reality, it's about finally seeing it. So if there's one thing I hope readers carry with them after closing the book, it's this: that hope is worth holding, kindness matters, and that a little bit of magic can change everything if we let it. Before I finish tonight, I want to say thank you. Thank you for coming, for listening, for believing in the power of stories. Thank you for supporting local authors, local libraries, and the idea that art still matters. Because without readers, stories are just ink on paper. You're the ones who breathe life into them. You're the real magic in all of this. So thank you for letting me share a little of my journey and a little of Plymbury with you tonight.